A secret war was fought not with swords, but with coins. Long before modern sanctions, ancient empires deployed a devastating and deniable weapon: state-sponsored counterfeiting. This was not simple crime, but a calculated strategy of economic warfare. Rival kingdoms would secretly produce vast quantities of fake or debased versions of an enemy's currency, flooding their markets to spark inflation, shatter public trust, and ultimately cripple their financial system from within. By the end of this journey, you will understand how these hidden operations toppled economies and shifted the balance of power in the ancient world. We will investigate how a flood of bad silver might have broken Athens, why Rome feared imitation denarii, and how a Persian forgery could destabilize a Byzantine border. What does it truly take to break the backbone of a civilization without ever declaring war? The battlefield was not always a field at all. For ancient empires, true power was measured in grain, in gold, and in the unshakable trust people placed in the coins that passed through their hands. This was the arena of economic warfare, a conflict fought with ledgers and ingots long before armies ever met. While history books are filled with tales of sacked cities and stolen treasures, that was merely the final, violent transaction. The real strategy often began much earlier, a rival's very foundation. This could take overt forms, like a naval blockade choking off vital grain shipments to a coastal city, or a kingdom seizing control of distant silver mines to starve an enemy of the raw material for its currency. These were acts of war, clear and declared, but there existed a far more subtle and arguably more dangerous dimension to this conflict. It operated in the shadows of the marketplace, in the quiet doubt of a merchant weighing a coin. When direct confrontation was too costly or too risky, a state could turn to a deniable, devastating covert operation, the deliberate sabotage of the enemy's money itself. This sophisticated tactic required a specific world to exist, one where economies were interconnected through trade, and where value was universally agreed upon and stamped onto pieces of metal. Only in such a world could corrupting that single symbol of trust become a weapon capable of breaking nations. And so, we turn to the masterstroke of this hidden war, the art of turning an empire's greatest strength, its currency, into its most profound weakness. A coin was far more than a piece of stamped metal. It was a compact, a sacred promise between a ruler and their people. Its value rested on two unspoken pillars everyone believed in. First, the intrinsic worth of the material itself, a specific weight of pure silver or gold you could trust. Second, and just as crucial, the guarantee stamped by the issuing authority, the king or republic whose face on the coin pledged its authenticity. Shatter faith in either pillar, and the entire economic system built upon it begins to tremble. This is the precise vulnerability state-sponsored counterfeiters aimed to exploit. Their goal was not to steal a single transaction, but to engineer a controlled collapse from within. The mechanics were devastatingly simple in theory. By secretly producing and releasing a flood of imitation coins into an enemy's economy, they artificially and rapidly increased the total money supply. These forgeries were not perfect copies. They were subtly lethal, containing less precious metal than the official standard, or sometimes being mere copper or lead cores plated with a thin silver wash. As these inferior coins mixed with the real ones, a dangerous economic principle took hold. Because every coin looked roughly the same, but their actual metal value was different, people instinctively began to behave in a predictable, destructive way. They would spend the bad coins first, hoarding the genuine, high silver pieces away for safekeeping. This is the core of what economists later called Gresham's Law, where bad money actively drives good money out of circulation. The marketplace becomes poisoned with distrust. A merchant, unsure if the coin offered is true or false, raises prices to compensate for the risk, leading to inflation. Soldiers paid in suspect coin find their wages buy less food. Farmers refuse to sell grain for money they cannot trust. The state itself faces catastrophe as tax revenues arrive in a worthless mixture of metal, crippling its ability to fund armies, build infrastructure, or maintain order. The target nation is thus forced to fight a war on two fronts, one against a visible enemy and another, far more insidious battle against the crumbling value of the very coins in its own treasury. Among the gleaming silver coins of the ancient Mediterranean, one stood supreme, the Athenian owl. Struck from the rich veins of the laurium mines, this tetradrachm was more than Athenian money. It was the dollar of its day, trusted from Egypt to the Black Sea for its consistent purity and weight. Athens' immense power during the 5th century before the Common Era was built directly upon this silver, funding its mighty navy and the grand monuments of the Acropolis. Yet this very strength painted a target on the iconic bird. When the decades-long conflict known as the Peloponnesian War erupted between Athens and Sparta, it presented a unique economic puzzle. Sparta commanded the finest infantry in Greece, but its economy was agrarian, landlocked, and crucially, it possessed no significant silver mines of its own. How could a land power of hoplites and kings hope to cripple a maritime empire financed by a river of silver? The answer may have been forged in secrecy. Across the Aegean world, archaeologists have uncovered coin hoards buried in periods of crisis. Mixed among pristine Athenian owls are curious imitations. These coins bear the familiar image of Athena and her owl, but they are cruder, lighter, and tests reveal they are often made of base metal with only a thin silver coating. Significantly, many of these forgeries are found in regions under Spartan influence or along crucial supply routes. The pattern suggests a coordinated campaign, not random crime. Scholars proposing the economic warfare theory argue that Sparta, unable to match Athenian financial might, turned to a weapon of the weak. By flooding the market with these deceptive tetradrachms, they could achieve multiple goals simultaneously. They could pay for supplies and mercenaries abroad with cheaply made fake currency. They could sow distrust in the Athenian monetary system, and they could cause inflation within Athens' own allied territories, straining those political bonds. Every bad owl in circulation devalued every real one, quietly transferring wealth from Athens to its enemies. However, this narrative is not without its challenges. Other historians caution that the evidence, while suggestive, is not a smoking scroll. Could these forgeries be the work of opportunistic pirates or local rulers simply capitalizing on the owl's reputation, rather than a covert Spartan state policy? The debate continues, highlighting the shadowy nature of this kind of warfare. Whether a deliberate strategy or an emergent symptom of conflict, the debased owls tell a compelling story. They reveal how, in a time of total war, the battlefield extended into the very metal people held in their hands, and how the trust in a simple coin could become the most critical front of all. The shadow of economic warfare stretched far beyond the Greek world, reaching its most dramatic scale in the brutal struggle between Rome and Carthage. The 3 Punic Wars were conflicts of existential survival, fought across the sea and famously decided by generals like Hannibal and Scipio. Yet behind the epic battles at Cannae and Zoma raged a quieter, equally desperate contest over resources. Carthage was a commercial titan, its coffers filled by lucrative trade networks and, most importantly, by the seemingly endless silver flowing from its mines in Spain. This wealth allowed it to field vast mercenary armies, a force Rome, still consolidating its power in Italy, struggled to match financially. The strain on the Roman treasury was immense, pushing the Republic to adopt extraordinary measures, from emergency taxes to pleading for private donations from its wealthy citizens. In this environment of total war, where every advantage was sought, a provocative theory emerges from the numismatic record. Some historians suggest that Rome, unable to outspend Carthage, may have attempted to undermine its enemy's financial engine through a campaign of currency sabotage. The evidence lies in a curious pattern of coins. In the 3rd century before the Common Era, coinciding with the First and Second Punic Wars, there was a sudden and widespread appearance of very poor quality Carthaginian coinage across the Western Mediterranean. These were primarily bronze and electrum coins, a lower value currency crucial for everyday military pay and local transactions. The official Carthaginian issues were of decent, standardized quality. But these new, suspicious coins were often crudely struck, lightweight, and made of inconsistent or base metals. They flooded areas of conflict, particularly Sicily and Sardinia, where Carthaginian armies operated and needed to pay troops and purchase supplies. The strategic logic for Roman sponsorship is chillingly clear. By introducing a flood of bad Carthaginian currency into the zones where Carthage needed to spend, Rome could trigger a cascade of economic problems. Local merchants and suppliers receiving these worthless bronzes would lose faith in Carthaginian money. They might refuse it, demand payment in silver, or drastically raise their prices. This would directly hamper Carthage's ability to sustain its mercenary forces, who themselves would become discontent if their pay could not buy food or supplies. A mercenary army that is not paid is an army that deserts or worse, turns on its employer. Economic sabotage, in this view, was a force multiplier, a way to corrode Carthage's military strength from within before a single legionary engaged. However, as with the Athenian owls, the story is not perfectly clear-cut. Other scholars offer alternative explanations that highlight the difficulty of proving ancient covert operations. Could this proliferation of bad coinage simply be the result of local civic mints under Carthaginian control, desperately debasing their own currency to meet wartime expenses? Or were they the work of opportunistic counterfeiters, unaffiliated with any state, capitalizing on the chaos of war to make a quick profit? The archaeological record presents a puzzle where the pieces fit several possible pictures. The sheer volume and geographic spread of the forgeries suggest organization beyond petty crime, pointing toward some level of institutional support. Yet without a recovered Roman state document ordering the operation, definitive proof remains elusive. This ambiguity is the perfect cloak for economic warfare. Whether it was a calculated Roman strategy, a desperate Carthaginian measure, or a chaotic mix of both, the result was the same. The monetary landscape upon which Carthage's military logistics depended became unstable and untrustworthy. It forces us to consider that while Hannibal was crossing the Alps with his elephants, another, invisible front in their war was already being fought in the market stalls and army camps, with the weapon being nothing more than a handful of deliberately corrupted bronze. The weapon of counterfeit currency could also be turned inward, a tool not for toppling a foreign rival, but for carving an empire apart from within. This is the story of the vast but fragile Hellenistic world that emerged after Alexander the Great, where the very symbols of imperial unity became the blueprints for rebellion. The Seleucid Empire, stretching from modern Turkey to the borders of India, faced a constant challenge of controlling its distant provinces. Its primary tool of administration was the silver tetradrachm, a coin bearing the portrait of the ruling king, a portable piece of propaganda that declared his authority in every marketplace from Antioch to the Hindu Kush. Yet this strength contained a critical vulnerability. For a provincial governor or satrap dreaming of independence, minting his own coins was the ultimate act of defiance. But starting a new currency from scratch was risky and slow, requiring merchants and soldiers to accept an untested symbol. There was a faster, more cunning path. A rebel could simply copy the existing, trusted Seleucid coinage. They would use the same familiar designs, the same weight standard, and the same portrait of the faraway king, but with one tiny, treasonous alteration. The secret lay in the mint mark, a small symbol or monogram on the coin that identified which official imperial mint had produced it. A rebel satrap, by producing coins with a new, unauthorized mint mark, could achieve several devastating goals at once. First, he could fund his rebellion. The silver from local mines or plundered temples could be stamped into coins that looked exactly like the money his own soldiers were used to receiving, ensuring their loyalty was paid for with what seemed like legitimate currency. Second, he could begin the slow process of legitimizing his own rule. As his rebellion solidified, he might gradually change the coins, first by adding his own monogram, and later by replacing the Seleucid king's portrait with his own. This numismatic journey mirrors the political one, from subject to rebel to sovereign king. Third, and most insidiously, this operation directly drained the central treasury's authority. Every fake Seleucid coin in circulation diluted the economic power of Antioch. It created a parallel financial system that answered to a local warlord, not the emperor. We see this theory play out dramatically in the eastern reaches of the empire, in the region of Bactria, what is now Afghanistan and parts of Central Asia. The Greco-Bactrian kingdom began as a distant Seleucid province. Over time, its governors grew increasingly autonomous. The coins tell the story of their creeping independence. Early issues are near-perfect copies of Seleucid types. Then, the portraits become more stylized. The Greek inscriptions begin to include the names of local rulers alongside the Seleucid kings. Finally, we get fully independent Bactrian coinage, famously beautiful portraits of kings like Euthydemus and Menander, who declared themselves fully sovereign. This numismatic secession was a quiet, economic declaration of war. It demonstrates how the machinery of state-sponsored counterfeiting was not solely an instrument of foreign policy. In the hands of an ambitious provincial leader, the royal mint became a factory for fracturing an empire, one carefully struck silver coin at a time. The portrait on the currency was no longer a symbol of unity, but a mask behind which a new power was patiently building its own throne. Rome's own currency, the denarius, became a symbol of imperial might. For centuries, this silver coin was the stable heartbeat of a vast economy, paying legions, funding roads, and uniting the Mediterranean world under a single monetary standard. The Roman state guarded this symbol with severe legal force. The crime of falsum, counterfeiting the imperial coinage, was considered a direct attack on the emperor's authority and the security of the state itself, punishable by exile or worse. This internal control was absolute, but it could not protect the denarius once it traveled beyond the frontier, and travel it did in enormous quantities. Rome had a persistent trade imbalance with the East, sending endless streams of silver denarii to pay for luxuries like Chinese silk, Indian spices, and Arabian incense. This wealth flowed directly into the hands of Rome's great eastern rival, the Parthian Empire. The relationship between Rome and Parthia was a tense stalemate of sporadic wars and diplomatic maneuvering, a cold war fought across the Syrian desert. All that Roman silver pouring into Parthian territory presented both a problem and an opportunity. For Parthia, it was a problem because it created economic dependence on the enemy's currency. But it also presented a breathtaking opportunity for economic warfare. Could Parthia, or the network of client kingdoms under its influence, turn this flood of silver against its source? The theory is as logical as it is subversive. by systematically melting down genuine Roman denarii and restriking them into lighter, debased copies. A state actor could achieve two strategic goals. First, they could effectively multiply their money supply, creating 2 or 3 coins from the silver of one, using the profit to fund border raids or fortify key positions. Second, and more dangerously, they could funnel these inferior coins back into the Roman frontier provinces. A legionary on the Euphrates frontier, paid in what looked like good Roman silver, might actually be receiving a Parthian-sponsored forgery. This would slowly poison the Roman economy in the very regions where it needed to be strongest, breeding inflation and distrust where stability was crucial for defense. The evidence for such a coordinated Parthian operation in the early imperial period is tantalizing but, like the Spartan case, not definitive. However, the most compelling proof of this practice emerges from a later, even more desperate chapter of history, when the Roman Empire itself began to crack under pressure. The Roman monetary system faced its ultimate test not from a foreign rival, but from within its own crumbling heart. By the middle of the 3rd century, the empire was in a state of near-total collapse, besieged by invaders on every frontier and torn apart by a rapid, bloody succession of emperors. In this desperate scramble for survival, the state itself committed an act of economic self-sabotage. The silver denarius had long since faded, replaced by a new coin called the Antoninianus, distinguished by the radiate crown on the emperor's portrait. To fund endless civil wars and pay off restless armies, emperors like Gallienus repeatedly debased this coinage, reducing its silver content to a mere silver wash over bronze. The official money was becoming worthless, and in the distant provinces like Britain and Gaul, the economic lifeline to Rome was fraying to a thread. Then something fascinating and strange happened. Across the countryside, in the soil of abandoned villas and beneath the floors of old temples, people began burying hoards of coins. And within these troves, archaeologists find a bizarre currency. Alongside the official, poor-quality radiates are thousands upon thousands of even cruder imitations. These are the Barbarous radiates, tiny, misshapen coins, often barely recognizable, struck with blundered inscriptions and grotesque portraits. They are so small and lightweight they seem almost like toy money. This phenomenon presents historians with a gripping mystery. Were these crude coins evidence of a new external economic war, or were they a symptom of internal societal breakdown? One compelling theory points to the political fragmentation of the era. In the West, a breakaway Gallic empire had split from Rome, while in the East, the powerful trading city of Palmyra under Queen Zenobia asserted its own control. These separatist states needed to pay their own armies and administrations. Could the Barbarous Radiates represent a state-sponsored, if hastily organized, attempt by these new empires to produce emergency currency? The sheer volume of these coins and their concentration in certain regions suggests a level of coordination beyond individual blacksmiths. Perhaps local authorities, cut off from the official mints in Italy, authorized any workshop with a die and a hammer to strike coins to keep the local economy functioning, resulting in this flood of crude but officially sanctioned imitations. The alternative explanation is more grassroots and just as telling. With official coin shipments from Rome interrupted by invasion and civil war, a severe coin shortage would have paralyzed daily life. In this vacuum, local communities, merchants, or even veteran soldiers familiar with minting techniques may have taken matters into their own hands. They would have melted down any old metal they could find and struck copies of the only coin type they knew, the radiate, to facilitate basic trade for food and supplies. The declining quality over time, from semi-decent copies to tiny, illegible blobs of metal, mirrors the deepening desperation of the era. This debate gets to the very core of what these coins represent. Are they the tools of emerging states trying to build a new order, or are they the tragic artifacts of a society reverting to a barter economy, clinging to the ghost of a monetary system that had already ceased to function? The Barbarous Radiates, in their silent multitudes, tell us that when the central authority of Rome dissolved, the response was not uniform chaos, but a frantic, localized scramble to fill the void. Whether by imperial decree or village necessity, the act of creating money had slipped from the hands of the emperor and into the hands of anyone with a hammer, signaling the end of one world and the painful, uncertain birth of another. This shadow war between empires reached a new peak of sophistication in the ancient world's final great rivalry. For centuries, the Byzantine Empire and the Sasanian Persian Empire stood as twin superpowers, locked in a grueling stalemate across the rugged borderlands of Mesopotamia and the Caucasus. Their conflicts were not just about territory, but about controlling the lucrative Silk Road trade and asserting religious and cultural supremacy. When direct military campaigns failed to deliver a decisive victory, both sides turned to more subtle instruments of power. And here, the archaeological record reveals a campaign of economic sabotage so precise it points directly to state sponsorship. Across contested frontier zones, coin hoards from this period contain a revealing mixture. Alongside legitimate Byzantine currency are strange imposters. These are counterfeit gold solidi, the most prestigious coin of the Byzantine realm, and copper falls, the workhorse coins of everyday commerce. At first glance, they are convincing. The gold forgeries have the right weight, the proper sheen, and bear the image of the reigning Byzantine emperor. But upon closer inspection, the craftsmanship betrays them. The portraits are slightly off, the lettering contains subtle errors, and metallurgical analysis shows the gold is often alloyed with cheaper metals. The copper falls are even more blatant, being lighter and of poorer metal than official issues. The geographic pattern of these finds is the true tell. They cluster in strategic border regions and key trading hubs, precisely where economic stability was most vital for Byzantine control. This was not random crime. The logistics alone point to a high-level operation. Producing a convincing fake of a high-value gold coin required significant expertise. You needed skilled die cutters to engrave the complex imperial portrait, access to precious metals, and organized mints to produce these fakes in volume. This was beyond the capability of a lone criminal. It required the resources and protection of a state. The strategic goals for the Sasanians were multifaceted and devastatingly effective. First, by flooding border markets with debased Byzantine currency, they could create inflation and economic chaos in precisely the regions Byzantium relied on for supplies and local loyalty. A merchant in Armenia or Syria, repeatedly cheated by bad coins, would lose faith in Byzantine economic authority. Second, it was a brilliant way to finance Persian military operations. A Persian agent could use cheaply produced fake solidi to pay spies, bribe local chieftains, or purchase supplies within Byzantine territory, essentially funding covert actions with their enemies' own corrupted currency. Third, and most broadly, it was a weapon aimed at the symbol of Byzantine power itself. The solidus was more than money. It was a piece of imperial propaganda, a tiny disc that communicated the emperor's God-given authority. By counterfeiting it, the Sasanians were not just stealing value, they were undermining the very aura of invincibility and legitimacy that held the Byzantine world together. This was economic warfare as psychological warfare, a silent assault on the foundations of trust that allowed an empire to function. The sophistication of the forgeries suggests this was not a fleeting tactic, but a sustained, covert pillar of Sasanian grand strategy, proving that in the long twilight struggle between empires, the most dangerous attacks often came not from the point of a spear, but from the heart of a mint. While empires clashed over silver and gold in the West, a revolutionary monetary experiment was unfolding in the East. The Tang Dynasty of China, during its golden age, presided over one of the most sophisticated and prosperous economies the world had ever seen. Its capital, Chang'an, was a cosmopolitan hub where merchants from across Asia traded silks, spices, and ceramics. But this vast commercial network faced a critical logistical problem. Transporting heavy strings of bronze coins or bulky silver ingots across thousands of miles was slow, dangerous, and invited banditry. The Tang solution was an innovation that would change finance forever, a system known as flying cash. This was not paper money as we know it today, but a form of government-certified credit. A merchant in the capital could deposit his coins with a provincial treasury office and receive a paper certificate stating its value. He could then travel light to a distant city, present that certificate at the corresponding treasury office there, and receive his coins back in local currency. It was a brilliant system of state-backed transfer, eliminating the physical risk of moving treasure. Yet this very innovation created a new and profound vulnerability. For the first time in history, a major economy began to anchor significant trust not in a tangible piece of metal, but in a piece of stamped paper. And where trust is placed in a symbol, that symbol can be forged. Imagine the potential for sabotage. A rival state on the Tang frontier, like the Tibetan Empire or the Uyghur Khaganate, or perhaps internal rebel forces during the tumultuous and Lushan rebellion, would have had a powerful incentive to undermine Tang stability. The hypothesis is compelling, if fiendishly difficult to prove. If agents could produce convincing forgeries of these flying cash certificates, they could unleash financial chaos. They could flood a distant commercial center with fake paper credits, arriving to claim vast sums of silver or bronze from the treasury offices, draining regional coffers. Or they could simply circulate the forgeries in markets, destroying merchant confidence in the entire system. The genius of such an attack lay in its targeted impact. Unlike debasing a coinage that affects everyone, corrupting flying cash would specifically cripple the long-distance trade that was the lifeblood of Tang prosperity and state revenue. It would be a surgical strike against the dynasty's economic connectivity. The evidential challenge, of course, is immense. Paper is fragile, and almost no actual examples of flying cash survive. We are left with historical descriptions in administrative texts, not the forged artifacts themselves. This lack of physical proof means the theory remains in the realm of logical deduction. Yet the logic is powerfully appealing. The Tang system was a precursor to the paper money that would later emerge in the Song dynasty. Attacking this nascent, paper-based trust was a form of economic warfare perfectly suited to the future. It suggests that the moment a society invents a more abstract form of money, it simultaneously invents a new and potentially more devastating frontier for covert attack. The battlefield was no longer just the mint, but the very idea of credit itself. The gold dinar of the medieval Islamic world was more than a coin, it was a statement of divine order. Struck with verses from the Quran and the name of the ruling caliph, it represented both economic might and spiritual legitimacy. The Abbasid Caliphate at its height established a golden standard, literally and figuratively. Their dinars, minted in Baghdad with exceptional purity, became the trusted currency of trade routes stretching from the Atlantic coast of Africa to the markets of India. To hold an Abbasid dinar was to hold a piece of a universal Islamic community, the Ummah, in your hand. This very universality, however, made it a perfect target in the political and theological fractures that followed. As rival dynasties rose, each claiming their own authority, the currency became a new front in their struggle. The Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt, champions of the Ismaili branch of Islam and direct challengers to Abbasid Sunni supremacy, presented a profound dilemma. They needed a currency that would be accepted in international trade, yet they also sought to proclaim their own spiritual and political legitimacy. One solution, scholars suggest, may have been a form of economic and propaganda warfare that struck at both goals simultaneously. The Fatimids are known to have produced their own beautiful and high-quality gold dinars, but there is intriguing numismatic evidence that they, or entities within their sphere of influence, may have also engaged in copying their rivals' coins. Imagine a merchant in a port city like Alexandria receiving a gold dinar. It bears the name and titles of the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, a coin accepted everywhere. Yet, upon closer inspection, the calligraphy might be slightly imperfect, or the mint mark might hint at an origin in Fatimid-controlled territory. The strategic value of such an operation would be immense. First, it allowed the Fatimids to participate in the broader economy using a currency that carried the trust of the Abbasid brand, effectively free riding on their rivals' financial reputation. They could pay foreign mercenaries or purchase strategic goods without having to first establish the full credibility of their own new coinage. Second, and more insidiously, it was a direct attack on Abbasid authority. Every fake Abbasid dinar in circulation subtly diluted the link between the Baghdad Caliph's name and guaranteed value. If enough suspect coins appeared, merchants might start to doubt even the genuine articles, breeding hesitation and friction in trade networks that the Abbasids relied upon. This was not merely theft, it was a quiet campaign to hollow out a symbol. The religious dimension made this act particularly potent. A coin was a sacred object carrying the word of God. To counterfeit it was thus a dual sin, a violation of economic trust and a blasphemous misuse of holy text for political gain. It transformed the marketplace into a battlefield of ideology, where the very tools of unity could be forged into weapons of division. A similar story may have unfolded at the opposite end of the Islamic world. In Al-Andalus, the Umayyad Emirate and later Caliphate of Cordoba stood as a glorious counterpoint to the Abbasids in the east. They too produced magnificent gold dinars, yet so powerful was the Abbasid currency's reach that even in Spain, coins minted in Baghdad circulated widely. For the Umayyads, asserting complete independence required economic independence. Producing imitations of Eastern dinars could serve a clear purpose, redirecting the wealth of Mediterranean trade towards Cordoba's coffers while gradually shifting merchant loyalty to the local currency. Each gold piece, whether real or imitation, was a tiny ambassador. A genuine Abbasid dinar preached the supremacy of Baghdad. A Fatimid or Umayyad copy, even one that mimicked the Abbasid design, was a smuggled message, whispering that another power was capable of mastering the same economic and divine language. This silent war of minting presses shows us that in a world bound by faith and commerce, the most effective attacks often sought not to destroy a currency, but to corrupt its meaning from within, turning a symbol of unity into an instrument of fracture. But this silent war of currencies was never one-sided. For every clever forger in a hidden mint, there stood an empire determined to protect the lifeblood of its economy. The targets of these covert operations were not passive victims. They were sophisticated states that developed elaborate systems of economic defense, turning their coins into fortresses of trust. No empire illustrates this defensive ingenuity better than Byzantium, the heir to Rome that survived for 1,000 years by mastering both war and commerce. To safeguard its legendary gold solidus, the Byzantines engineered their currency to be as difficult to copy as it was valuable. They began with the metal itself, maintaining an almost fanatical commitment to purity. For centuries, the solidus held a consistent, legendary standard of nearly 24-karat gold, a reliability that made it the most desired coin across 3 continents. But purity alone was not enough. The real artistry lay in the coin's design. Byzantine engravers were master craftsmen, creating intricate, deeply stamped portraits of emperors and religious figures with exquisite detail. The portraits on a solidus were not simple profiles. They were complex images with fine lines in the hair, delicate features, and elaborate ceremonial robes. These details served a dual purpose. They were stunning propaganda, but they were also a formidable technical barrier. A forger would need a die cutter of equal skill to capture that complexity, and any mistake in the portrait or the Greek inscription would be an immediate red flag to a suspicious merchant. The Byzantines also standardized weights with remarkable precision. A merchant in Constantinople or Antioch would have access to official scales, and a solidus that was even slightly light would be rejected. This created a system where the coin's value was locked into three inseparable qualities: its guaranteed gold content, its exact weight, and its flawless imperial image. To coordinate this defense, the empire established a tightly controlled network of mints, primarily in the capital Constantinople and a few other key cities like Thessalonica. Each mint had its own secret mark, a tiny symbol or letter combination stamped onto the coin. This mint mark was a critical tool for accountability. If a batch of suspicious coins appeared in circulation, authorities could trace them back to the specific mint and potentially the individual workshop where they were produced, allowing for swift investigation. This system of authentication was backed by the full, terrifying force of imperial law. The great legal code of the later Byzantine Empire, the Basilica, which updated the ancient laws of Justinian, was unequivocal. Counterfeiting was not a simple crime of fraud. It was an act of high treason, a direct assault on the authority of the emperor and the stability of the state. The prescribed punishments were severe, ranging from the confiscation of all property and permanent exile to physical mutilation. The law recognized that attacking the currency was an attack on the very fabric of society, and it responded with corresponding harshness. Yet laws and mint marks in the capital were meaningless if they could not be enforced in the bustling ports and dusty frontier markets where fake coins entered circulation. This is where the Byzantine bureaucracy deployed its economic sentinels, officials known as the Commissarioi. These were imperial trade officers stationed in key commercial cities and border crossings. Part tax collector, part quality control inspector, the Commissarioi had the authority to examine the currency used in major transactions. They would check for proper weight, test the metal for purity using touchstones, and scrutinize the craftsmanship of the coins. Their presence created a constant layer of scrutiny, a tangible reminder that the state was watching. A merchant planning to pass off a handful of Persian made solidi would think twice if he knew his shipment would be inspected by an official with the power to seize the entire lot and bring serious legal consequences. This multi-layered defense, blending artistic complexity, metallurgical consistency, legal terror, and bureaucratic vigilance, shows that economic warfare was a dynamic duel. For every innovation in deception, there was a corresponding innovation in protection. The silent war was not just fought by shadowy agents in borderlands. It was also fought in the mint halls of Constantinople and the offices of the Commissarioi, where an empire invested immense resources to ensure that its word, stamped in gold, remained as solid as the metal itself. The integrity of a coin was defended by artistry and law, but how exactly did an attacker breach those defenses? The answer lies not in grand strategy, but in the quiet, sooty workshops where metal met fire and force. To understand the silent war, we must step into the forger's world, a place of practical ingenuity and technological limitation. The ancient counterfeiter had two primary methods at their disposal: casting and striking, each with its own telltale signs. The simpler technique was casting. This involved taking a genuine coin and pressing it into soft clay or sand to create a detailed impression, a mold. Molten metal, often a cheap alloy of copper, lead, and a dash of silver for color, would be poured into this mold. Once cooled, the caster would break the clay away to reveal a rough copy. This method was accessible, requiring little specialized skill, but it had a fatal flaw. the casting process rarely captured the sharp, crisp detail of an original struck coin. The edges would be rounded, the surface might have tiny pits or bubbles from the molten metal, and most damningly, a faint seam line called a flash line would often remain where the two halves of the mold met. A merchant running his thumb over the surface would feel that ridge immediately, a clear sign of a cheap imitation. The far more sophisticated and dangerous method was striking. This mimicked the official minting process itself. It required the forger to create a pair of engraved metal dies, one for the obverse or front of the coin and one for the reverse. A blank metal disc called a planchet would be placed between these dies and struck with a heavy hammer. A well-made struck forgery could be incredibly convincing, replicating the sharpness and depth of an official issue. But here lay the supreme technological challenge. Creating those dies was an art form. An official die was engraved by a master craftsman, often working directly for the state, capable of rendering the subtle curls of an emperor's hair or the intricate folds of a goddess's robe in miniature steel. A forger needed equal skill. For a state-sponsored operation, this was not a barrier. A rival kingdom could easily employ or coerce its own master engravers, men who could study a captured Athenian owl or a Roman Denarius and painstakingly replicate its every feature onto a new die. They would also have access to official minting equipment and, crucially, to the correct metallurgical knowledge. Producing a fake silver coin that looked right was one thing. Producing one that felt right, that had the correct weight and ring, required knowing the precise alloy. State actors could obtain or analyze the real metal to get the formula exactly right. This access to superior technology and materials is what separates the likely state-sponsored forgeries from the crude private ones. When we find a coin that is chemically identical to an official issue with a die of near-perfect craftsmanship, it whispers of institutional backing. It suggests a workshop not in a hidden cellar, but within the walls of a palace or a governor's compound protected by authority. In contrast, the barbarous Radiates of the late Roman world, those tiny, blundered coins, tell a different story. Their grotesque portraits and garbled inscriptions point to a lack of skilled die cutters. Their lightweight, poor metal planchets suggest a desperate scramble for any available materials, perhaps melted down cookware or old tools. These are the artifacts of local necessity, of a village blacksmith or a retired soldier trying to keep commerce alive in a collapsing world, not of a coordinated sabotage campaign. This technical interlude grounds our theories in gritty reality. The quality of the fake is a direct clue to its origin. A perfect forgery required the resources of a state. A crude one spoke of individual desperation or local crisis. In the end, every counterfeit coin, whether a masterpiece of deception or a sad, misshapen blob, was a physical object born from a specific set of hands, tools, and intentions. By reading these material clues, we can begin to trace the invisible lines of economic conflict back to their source, from the marketplace where the coin was spent to the hidden workshop where it was born. Creating a perfect forgery in a hidden workshop was only the first, isolated step. The true challenge lay in moving these coins from the secrecy of the mint into the very heart of the enemy's economy, in volumes large enough to cause damage, yet quietly enough to avoid immediate detection. This required a distribution network, a shadowy supply chain operating in plain sight. The most effective channels were those that already existed, the arteries of normal commerce and conflict. Border markets and trade hubs were perfect vectors. A merchant caravan arriving from a neighboring, perhaps neutral, kingdom would bring goods and also pay for them with mixed bags of coin. If a significant portion of that payment consisted of subtly debased currency, it would enter circulation seamlessly. The local merchants, focused on the silver's gleam and familiar design, would accept it, and from their hands it would spread further inland, one innocent transaction at a time. Another direct method was through the machinery of war itself. Paying mercenary bands or subsidizing allied tribes on an enemy's frontier with counterfeit coin was a devastatingly efficient tactic. These groups would then spend that money locally to buy supplies, instantly injecting the bad currency into the target region's economy. The state sponsoring the forgery achieved two goals. It funded proxy forces and it poisoned the economic well of its rival, all with the same batch of metal. Perhaps the most brazen method involved corrupting official streams of wealth. Imagine a defeated enemy paying war reparations or annual tribute in silver. What if, before handing it over, the paying state secretly mixed a portion of counterfeit coins into the chests? The receiving treasury would count the coins, see the correct designs, and deposit them, unknowingly introducing the toxin directly into its own financial bloodstream. The entire operation hinged on secrecy and plausible deniability. A king could never be caught signing an order to counterfeit a rival's currency. It would be a scandal and a casus belli. So the work was delegated through layers to a trusted governor in a distant province or to a network of merchants with ambiguous loyalties. If a shipment of bad coins was intercepted, the official story could always be one of regrettable piracy or the actions of rogue criminals. This deniability was the weapon's greatest armor. It allowed empires to wage economic war while maintaining diplomatic smiles, to weaken a competitor from within while publicly blaming the resulting inflation on poor governance or market forces. The silent war was won not just in the mint, but on the caravan routes, in the army camps, and in the counting houses, anywhere that trust could be quietly, systematically replaced with doubt. Deniability was the invisible shield protecting empires in this silent war. A major power could never afford to be directly linked to the corruption of a rival's currency, for such an act would shatter diplomatic relations and invite devastating retaliation. To solve this, they turned to the ancient world's version of proxy actors, a network of allies, client states, and semi-autonomous border lords. These were the perfect middlemen, providing a crucial layer of insulation between the command and the crime. A client king ruling a buffer state between Rome and Parthia, for instance, occupied a unique position. He owed his throne to Roman support, but his survival also depended on navigating the complex politics of the frontier. Such a ruler could be quietly encouraged or subtly pressured to undertake a sensitive operation. His workshops could begin producing convincing forgeries of Parthian silver drachms. The benefits for Rome were immense and clean. The counterfeit coins would enter circulation through local border markets, naturally flowing into Parthian territory. If the operation was discovered, Rome could plausibly deny any involvement, attributing it to the criminal greed of a local chieftain or the independent actions of an unruly client. The client king himself might benefit from the arrangement, receiving Roman favors or a share of the profits from the minting operation, all while strengthening his own economic position against the Parthian neighbor. This proxy system turned the messy, contested borderlands into a deniable factory for economic sabotage. We can see a similar dynamic in the later rivalry between Byzantium and Persia. A Persian satrap governing a restless frontier province had his own ambitions and local resources. With a quiet nod from the Shahanshah in Ctesiphon, he could authorize his mints to produce imitations of Byzantine gold solidi. These coins would then be used to pay his own border troops or to fund covert agents operating across the frontier. The sophistication of the forgeries found in these regions suggests access to skilled die cutters and proper metals, resources a local governor would likely only possess with some level of state support. For the sponsoring empire, the advantages were multifaceted. First, it placed the physical risk and legal culpability on a subordinate, shielding the central authority from scandal. Second, it leveraged local knowledge, as these border rulers understood the specific trade routes and market conditions where the fake currency would be most effective. Third, it created a self-sustaining cycle. The proxy state could use the profits from the operation to fund its own defenses, further stabilizing a frontier zone important to the patron. This outsourcing transformed currency warfare from a centralized state strategy into a distributed, resilient network of aggression. It meant that an empire could be attacked not just by the direct action of its rival, but by the quiet ambition of a dozen minor kings and governors, each acting with a hidden mandate. The battlefield of trust was thus policed not only by imperial guards, but by a fog of plausible deniability, where the true origin of a destabilizing coin could be lost in the intricate web of allegiance and ambition that defined the ancient world's frontiers. This shadow war of currencies thrived in darkness, leaving behind a historian's greatest challenge, a profound lack of direct evidence. You will not find a recovered scroll from a Spartan king ordering the forgery of Athenian owls, or a signed decree from a Persian shah commanding the debasement of Roman denarii. The success of these operations depended on state secrecy, on the absolute deniability that insulated emperors and generals from the consequences of their economic sabotage. Programs of this nature would have been guarded with the same severity as military campaign plans or assassination plots, discussed in hushed tones and never committed to official records that could be captured or leaked. The written orders, if they existed at all, were likely destroyed the moment they were read. This deliberate silence from the historical record is not an argument against the theory. It is, in fact, consistent with its very premise. A state caught red-handed in such an act would face unified outrage and legitimized retaliation. Therefore, the absence of a smoking gun document is precisely what we should expect from a successful clandestine strategy. So how do we pierce this veil of ancient secrecy? We turn to the indirect evidence, the subtle tremors in the economic landscape that hint at the hidden earthquake. One key clue is the pattern of sudden, localized inflation. Ancient historians like the Roman writer Tacitus occasionally note periods where prices for grain or goods skyrocketed in a specific frontier province, crises that cannot be fully explained by poor harvests or simple warfare. When such an inflationary spike occurs in a region under known economic pressure from a rival power, it raises a compelling question: was this chaos natural, or was it engineered by a flood of bad money introduced from across the border? Another fragmentary clue comes from diplomacy. Surviving letters between rulers or complaints lodged by trading guilds sometimes contain veiled accusations of monetary manipulation. A Byzantine merchant's petition might protest the prevalence of light and false gold in a certain market, a complaint that, when cross-referenced with coin finds from that area, begins to build a circumstantial case. The most powerful evidence, however, lies not in texts but in the coins themselves, subjected to the forensic tools of modern science. This is where numismatics, the study of currency, merges with archaeometallurgy. Researchers no longer rely solely on the eye. They use X-ray fluorescence and mass spectrometry to analyze the precise elemental composition of ancient coins. This technology can reveal a hidden story. A hoard of Roman denarii, all bearing the same emperor's face, might show two distinct chemical signatures. One group has the consistent silver-copper alloy of the official Rome mint. The other, while visually similar, contains trace elements of gold or lead that match the ore profiles of mines in a hostile neighboring kingdom. This scientific fingerprint is as close as we can get to a confession. It tells us that these coins were not just crude imitations, but sophisticated forgeries produced from different raw materials in a different place by someone with access to advanced minting technology. The collective pattern of these hoards, where forgeries cluster in specific times and places of conflict, paints a map of economic aggression. We are left connecting the dots, but the picture that emerges is one of deliberate, intelligent design. The silence of the archives, then, is not empty. It is filled with the quiet testimony of metal, the ghostly imprint of a strategy so effective precisely because it was meant to leave no paper trail. The silent war of currencies did not end with the fall of ancient empires. Its principles resurfaced centuries later, during a crisis that gripped all of Europe, a mysterious period known to historians as the Great Bullion Famine. For much of the 15th century, from around 1440 to 1470, a severe and puzzling shortage of silver and gold plagued the continent. Mints slowed their production, merchants struggled to find acceptable coin for large transactions, and economies strained under the weight of a money supply that was literally shrinking. The conventional explanation points to deep trade imbalances with the East, where European silver flowed out to pay for silks and spices, never to return. Yet within this broad crisis, some regional shortages were so acute and so strategically timed that they hint at a more deliberate hand at work. Could the principles of economic warfare have been applied during this famine, not by global empires, but by rival trading powers within Europe itself? Consider the tense relationship between the Hanseatic League, the powerful network of German merchant cities, and the Kingdom of England. Their interactions were a volatile mix of commerce and conflict, with England seeking to break the Hanse's monopoly over Baltic trade. In this high-stakes environment, a simple but devastating tactic could have been employed. A state or league with access to bullion could deliberately withdraw high-quality coin from circulation in a rival's territory, either by hoarding it or by exporting it elsewhere, while simultaneously encouraging the circulation of poorer, debased coins within that rival's economy. This would create a localized bullion famine, crippling the target's ability to mint its own strong currency and fund its ambitions. The Hanseatic cities, with their control over the flow of silver from Central European mines, were in a perfect position to influence such a squeeze. Their economic pressure on England was often overt, but the subtle weapon of currency manipulation would have amplified it invisibly. Similarly, the fierce competition among Italian city-states like Venice, Genoa, and Florence involved constant financial maneuvering. A rival power seeking to gain an edge might quietly purchase or hoard the other's good silver coin, then flood the market with forgeries or intentionally debased issues from its own mint. This would force the targeted city to either devalue its currency publicly, damaging its hard-won reputation for reliability, or face a paralyzing lack of sound money. The bullion famine, therefore, may not have been a single event with one cause, but a complex crisis where natural economic forces were sharpened by human rivalry. While no treaty records a conspiracy to starve a competitor of silver, the patterns of shortage align too closely with zones of intense commercial conflict to ignore. It suggests that the ancient playbook for economic sabotage was never forgotten, merely adapted to the new battlefields of medieval trade fairs and banking houses, where the scarcity of metal itself could be weaponized to decide which power would thrive and which would falter. The shimmer of gold and silver eventually gave way to a quieter, more fragile medium. Centuries after the Tang experiment with flying cash, China under the Ming Dynasty made a bold and permanent leap, issuing the world's first true national paper currency, the baochao. This was not mere credit for merchants, but an emperor's decree that a printed note, bearing intricate designs and severe warnings against forgery, was to be accepted as money by everyone in the realm. It was a revolutionary vision of a cashless society, freeing the economy from the physical limits of mining and minting. Yet this very innovation created a vulnerability far greater than any debased coin. A government could now create wealth not by the slow, costly process of refining metal, but with the swift, silent stroke of a printing block. And the Ming emperors, facing endless military campaigns and grand projects, did exactly that. They printed Bayachao notes in staggering, uncontrolled volumes, flooding the economy with paper that was not backed by any corresponding reserve of silver. The result was a textbook economic disaster, a hyperinflation so severe that by the mid-15th century, a basket of goods required a wheelbarrow full of nearly worthless notes. The state's own overprinting was the primary engine of this collapse, but in the chaotic, distrustful atmosphere of a currency in freefall, a provocative possibility emerges. Could internal rivals or neighboring states have seen an opportunity to pour fuel on this fire? The technical barrier to such an attack was shockingly low. Forging a convincing silver coin required metal, skilled engravers, and heavy presses. Forging a paper note required little more than wood blocks, ink, and the right kind of paper, materials far easier to obtain and operations far easier to conceal. If a disgruntled provincial governor, a powerful merchant guild, or a rival state like the Mongols or Koreans wished to destabilize the Ming, producing and circulating their own counterfeit bayach would have been a devastatingly simple and deniable tactic. In an economy already drowning in official paper, who would notice a few more floods from a hidden source, each fake note would further erode the last shreds of public confidence, accelerating the panic and making the monetary system's total failure a certainty. While historical records focus on the government's own reckless printing, the silent, amplifying role of opportunistic forgers in this collapse remains a haunting question. It suggests that the ultimate form of economic warfare may not be to debase a currency, but to exploit a loss of faith so complete that even the genuine article becomes meaningless, turning the very symbol of imperial power into litter on the street. A coin was a tiny, circulating piece of a ruler's soul. Beyond its economic function, it was a physical covenant, a daily reminder to every citizen that the authority stamped upon it was real, stable, and capable of guaranteeing value. This psychological bond between the people and their sovereign was the ultimate target of the silent war. Economic sabotage aimed to bankrupt treasuries, but its more profound goal was to bankrupt trust. When a state secretly flooded a rival's realm with counterfeit currency, it was not merely manipulating markets, it was conducting a form of mass psychological operation. The attack was directed at the very idea of legitimacy. Imagine the moment a baker in a Roman frontier town or a silk merchant in a Byzantine market bites down on a suspect solidus and finds a core of lead. That physical betrayal sparks a mental chain reaction. If the emperor's face on this coin is a lie, what else from his government is untrue? Can his laws be trusted? Will his armies protect us? The doubt metastasizes from the marketplace into the political sphere. This erosion of confidence had immediate and dangerous consequences. One of the first casualties was the state's ability to collect taxes. If the money offered by taxpayers was itself suspect, how could provincial officials accept it as valid payment? Revenue collection would slow to a crawl, creating a financial crisis precisely when funds were needed most for defense or public works. More dangerously, the public might begin to actively resist tax demands, arguing that they were being forced to pay in good grain or labor for worthless bits of metal. This refusal was not simple greed, it was a fundamental breakdown of the social contract. The state promises order and security in exchange for revenue, but if the state's own tokens of that promise are fraudulent, why should the citizen uphold their end? This dynamic could spiral into civil unrest. Soldiers paid in debased coin might mutiny. Farmers unable to sell their crops for real money might hoard their grain, leading to local shortages and anger directed at distant, seemingly incompetent rulers. The ruler, in turn, would face an impossible choice. They could publicly acknowledge the forgery crisis, which would be an admission of weakness and a blow to their divine or imperial aura. Or they could attempt to force the bad coins into circulation at their face value, a move that would further alienate the merchant classes and accelerate economic collapse. Either path led to a crisis of authority. The genius of this psychological warfare was its deniable, gradual nature. Unlike a besieged city where the enemy is visible at the gates, here the enemy was invisible, operating through the universal medium of daily life. A king could not rally his people against a shadow. The resulting anxiety and suspicion fractured the internal unity of a realm, making it vulnerable not just to economic strain, but to political fragmentation and rebellion. The real victory in the Silent War was not measured in devalued currency, but in the quiet, corrosive question that began to echo in the minds of a populace, a simple, devastating doubt: who really guarantees our world? The Silent War left its evidence not in scrolls but in metal. Today, historians armed with technology become numismatic detectives, piecing together the truth from the coins themselves. The first and most revealing tool is X-ray fluorescence spectrometry, often called XRF. This remarkable device allows researchers to analyze a coin's elemental composition without causing any damage. By directing a focused X-ray beam at the surface, scientists can measure the unique energy signature emitted by the atoms within. The readout tells a precise story of the metal's recipe. A coin that looks like pure silver on the outside might reveal a hidden heart of copper or lead, a clear sign of a plated forgery meant to deceive by sight alone. Even more tellingly, XRF can detect trace elements that act like a chemical fingerprint. The silver from a mine in ancient Athens contains minute, unique impurities, different from silver sourced in Macedonia or Persia. If a supposed Athenian owl shows a trace element profile matching a rival kingdom's mines, it becomes powerful circumstantial evidence of a state-sponsored operation, revealing not just a fake, but its likely geographic origin. Beyond the metal's heart, scientists examine its skin. High-powered microscopes and surface analysis techniques scrutinize the minutest details of a coin's production. The way a genuine coin was struck leaves specific marks, a certain flow of metal under the immense pressure of the die. A cast forgery, made by pouring molten metal into a mold, shows a completely different surface texture, often with tiny gas bubbles or a telltale seam line. Even among struck coins, the wear patterns on a die over time create a narrative, a series of forgeries that all share the same tiny, unique flaw in the die's engraving. A scratch or a chip can be linked to a single, clandestine workshop, tracing a campaign of sabotage to a specific source and time frame. This turns a pile of suspicious coins into a connected set, a serialized output from a hidden mint. The final piece of the puzzle comes from context through the study of coin hoards. Where and how coins are discovered speaks volumes. A hoard buried in a time of invasion near a contested border, containing a mix of pristine official coins and crude local imitations, tells one story, likely of personal emergency and a collapsing monetary system. But a hoard found in a stable commercial center, filled exclusively with high-quality yet chemically foreign imitations of the ruling power's currency, suggests something more deliberate. When such hoards appear in clusters across a strategic region during a known period of conflict, the pattern points toward a coordinated insertion of bad money. Hoard analysis helps answer the critical question: was this the work of a state seeking to undermine an enemy, or simply the symptom of a society in distress? By combining the chemical fingerprint from XRF, the manufacturing clues from surface analysis, and the strategic map provided by hoard patterns, modern science transforms theories into compelling evidence. We may never have the Spartan king's written order, but we can hold the forged owl he might have commissioned, and through it, listen to the echoes of a silent war fought for the trust of an entire civilization. Those scientific tools reveal the what but not always the why. Behind every chemically altered coin and every hidden hoard lies a fundamental question of intent, a puzzle that divides scholars to this day. When we uncover an ancient forgery, are we looking at the debris of a covert war, the loot of a pirate, or the desperate tool of a community in collapse? Historians generally cluster around three competing frameworks, each offering a different lens on the same piece of metal. The first and most dramatic is the state-sponsored economic warfare model we have explored. Its great strength is strategic logic. It explains why forgeries appear in specific geopolitical hotspots during times of open conflict, like the fake owls during the Peloponnesian War or the Persian-style solidi on the Byzantine frontier. This view treats the coins as deliberate, intelligent weapons, designed to destabilize a rival's financial system and erode public trust in their government. The weaknesses, however, are evidential. As we have seen, definitive proof is elusive by design. Could the patterns we see be coincidental, the unintended byproduct of other forces? This leads to the second major interpretation, large-scale piracy or organized crime. In this view, the counterfeit coins are not acts of war but acts of profit. The ancient Mediterranean was crisscrossed by merchant ships and caravan routes, equally trafficked by pirates and bandits. A skilled criminal network, operating from a hidden cove or a lawless border region, could certainly run a sophisticated counterfeiting ring. They would copy the most trusted currencies, the Athenian owl or the Roman denarius, to pass off their cheap imitations on unsuspecting merchants in crowded ports. The strength of this argument is its simplicity and universal motive. Greed needs no treaty. It nicely explains forgeries found far from battlefields in purely commercial contexts. Yet, critics ask, could such large-scale, technically proficient operations have flourished for decades without the tacit protection or even active partnership of local authorities? Piracy on this scale often blurs into informal state policy. The third framework shifts the focus from attack to survival, the monetary crisis model. Here, counterfeit coins are not weapons or criminal tools, but emergency measures. In times of severe coin shortage, often caused by trade breakdown, invasion, or the collapse of a central mint, local communities faced an impossible situation. How do you buy food, pay workers, or collect taxes when there is simply no official money to be had? The response, this theory argues, was grassroots minting. Local governors, army commanders, or even town councils would authorize the production of imitations to keep the local economy functioning. This explains the crudest forgeries, like the barbarous Radiates of the late Roman Empire, whose declining quality mirrors a world falling apart. The strength of this view is its human scale. It addresses a fundamental need. Its weakness is that it cannot easily account for the high-quality, geographically targeted forgeries that appear in periods of interstate rivalry, not internal collapse. So, which lens is correct for our key cases? For the Athenian owls, the warfare model is compelling but contested. The piracy model is plausible, while the crisis model seems less likely given Athens' still functioning mint. For the late Roman Barbarous Radiates, the crisis model feels most resonant, though elements of local warlord sponsorship, a form of microstate warfare, surely played a role. For the Byzantine Persian frontier forgeries, the technical sophistication and geographic precision heavily favor state sponsorship, with piracy being a less convincing explanation for such a politically sensitive operation. The truth, as it often is in history, likely involves a mixture. A single coin could wear multiple masks. A counterfeit drachma might be produced by a criminal network with the tacit approval of a provincial governor, who then uses it to pay a hostile tribe, effectively weaponizing it. The frameworks are not always mutually exclusive. They can operate in sequence. A state might initiate a warfare campaign. Criminal elements might then jump in to exploit the chaotic monetary environment, and local communities might ultimately respond with their own emergency issues. Yet, for understanding the grand shifts of power, the state sponsorship model carries the most weight. It connects isolated acts of forgery to the high strategy of empires, revealing how the manipulation of trust was calculated into the very art of ancient statecraft. The debate itself is a testament to the Silent War's success. Its architects left behind a perfect historical crime scene, one where the evidence points in several directions at once, forever keeping us questioning the line between chaos and conspiracy. A secret mint requires a perfect location, far from prying eyes yet close to the necessary resources. For our Roman emperor, a secluded villa estate in the province of Noricum, known for its iron and silver, would be ideal. The property, owned by a loyal equestrian with ties to the Imperial Intelligence Service, provides both cover and access. The villa's sprawling underground storage chambers, originally for grain and olive oil, are converted into a secure workshop. Ventilation shafts are discreetly rerouted to handle the fumes from smelting furnaces, and the constant, muffled clang of hammers is explained away as renovations. Here, the second phase begins, assembling the human element. The operation cannot rely on slaves from the imperial mint in Rome, whose loyalties are too public. Instead, the procurator in charge recruits a small, tight-knit team. He finds a master die cutter, a Greek artisan whose entire family is granted Roman citizenship and a generous pension in exchange for his silence and skill. A metallurgist, a retired military engineer who once supervised siege equipment, is brought in to manage the alloy, ensuring the silver content is just high enough to pass a cursory test but low enough to stretch the emperor's bullion reserves. Guards are drawn from the ranks of the emperor's personal Germanic bodyguard, men with no local ties and absolute loyalty sworn to the imperial person. This insulated cell operates in total secrecy, its members knowing that betrayal means not just their own end, but the disappearance of everyone they hold dear. With a team in place, the real work of deception begins. The craftsmen are provided with a chest of genuine Gallic Empire Antoniniani, captured from a recent skirmish or purchased by agents in neutral markets. The die cutter spends weeks studying them, not just the radiate portrait of the usurper Posthumus, but the subtle styles of the different Gallic mints at Lugdunum and Colonia Agrippina. He must capture the slightly crude, provincial flair of the engraving, a purposeful imperfection that makes a perfect fake unbelievable. He hand-carves several pairs of dies, introducing tiny, unique flaws into each, a secret signature that will allow Roman spies to track the dispersal of batches once they enter circulation. Meanwhile, the metallurgist works on the brew, official Gallic coinage pressed by a regime desperate for legitimacy, often used good silver. The Roman recipe is more cynical. He creates an alloy of copper, lead, and a thin coating of silver, calculated to have the right weight and initial shine, but destined to wear quickly and reveal its base heart after months of handling. The first strikes are tested relentlessly, compared against the originals under lamplight, weighed on precise scales, even given to a trusted merchant to see if it passes in a busy market without a second glance. Only when the imitation is indistinguishable to all but the most expert eye does full production begin. Forging the coin is only half the battle. Moving it into the enemy's economy is the true art of war. The coins cannot simply be dumped at the border, they must flow naturally. This is where the third pillar of the operation activates, the distribution network. The Roman intelligence service, the Frumentarii, already has assets throughout Gaul, men posing as Syrian wine merchants, Gallic horse traders, and shipping agents in the port of Massilia. These individuals become the vectors. Shipments of the counterfeit Antoniniani are carefully broken down. One crate is sealed inside a shipment of Spanish olive oil bound for a warehouse in Narbo. Another is mixed with legitimate currency used to pay a chieftain of the Lingons tribe, a nominal ally of the Gallic Empire whose loyalty is known to be for sale. The traders are given simple instructions: spend these coins gradually in different towns for everyday purchases, armor repairs, grain, and local wine. The goal is not to get rich but to seed doubt. A blacksmith in Augustogenum receives a handful of these coins for his work, and the next day uses them to buy flour from a miller, who then pays a farmer. Like a toxin in a river, the bad money spreads, its origin untraceable. To measure the success of this silent campaign, the emperor needs eyes and ears on the ground. His spies are tasked with observing not battles but marketplaces. They listen for the complaints. Is there grumbling among Gallic legionaries that their pay does not go as far? Are merchants in Lugdunum starting to weigh and bite every radiate coin, something they never did before? More concretely, agents attempt to collect samples of currency from different regions, sending them back to Noricum for analysis. If the metallurgist finds his own alloy coming back to him, he knows the operation is working. The counterfeit coins are circulating deeply and driving the purer Gallic issues out of the economy. The ultimate report might come from a spy within the Gallic treasury itself, whispering of a crisis meeting where officials debate a sudden, inexplicable shortage of silver bullion and a mysterious rise in prices that is straining the loyalty of the army. The emperor, reading such dispatches in Rome, receives no glorious battle trophy, but something perhaps more valuable: the certain knowledge that his rival is being bled dry from the inside, that the very symbol of his usurped power is turning to dross in the hands of his people. This composite narrative, woven from historical possibilities, makes the abstract strategy tangible, a chilling reminder of how ancient power could be projected not just with legions, but with a carefully struck piece of false silver and a network of whispers. The very coins meant to cripple a rival could carry a hidden curse for their creator. A weaponized currency, once released into the wild currents of ancient trade, was nearly impossible to control. It could flow back across the border, carried by merchants or returning soldiers, and begin to poison the economy of the nation that had minted it. This was the perilous blowback of economic warfare. A kingdom might flood its enemies' markets with debased silver, only to find that same bad silver returning a season later in payment for its own vital grain imports. The inflation they had sought to engineer abroad could now take root at home, a self-inflicted wound born of a strategy that treated money as a mere projectile, forgetting it was also a relentless boomerang. The interconnectedness of ancient economies meant no border was truly sealed to the movement of metal. A counterfeit solidus, whether made in a Persian workshop or a Byzantine one, entered a shared pool of currency used by Armenian traders and Syrian caravan masters. It did not carry a passport, it simply followed the paths of profit. The state that sponsored its creation could not recall it, and could only watch as the distrust it sowed began to ripple back through its own commercial networks, undermining the stability it had taken for granted. Beyond this economic backfire lay an even graver risk: the diplomatic catastrophe of exposure. If a rival empire uncovered definitive proof that its currency was being systematically forged by a hostile power, the response would be furious and legitimizing. Such an act was not seen as clever strategy, but as a profound violation of the unspoken rules of sovereignty and divine order. It could provide the perfect casus belli, a justified reason for a wider, more devastating war. A king caught in the act would be branded a faithless trickster, his reputation shattered among allies and neutrals alike. The moral high ground, so important for rallying domestic support and securing alliances, would be instantly lost. The covert operation meant to avoid open conflict could instead become the very spark that ignited it, transforming a war of whispers into a cataclysm of clashing armies. History offers sobering parallels to this loss of control. Consider the concept of sanctions in more recent centuries, where one nation restricts trade with another to force political change. Time and again, these measures have demonstrated how economic weapons can ricochet, harming civilian populations, creating black markets, and often strengthening the resolve of the targeted regime rather than weakening it. The ancient counterfeiters faced a similar paradox. By debasing their rival's currency, they might inadvertently debase the very idea of trusted money across the entire region, creating a crisis of confidence that spared no one. A merchant once burned by a bad Byzantine coin might become suspicious of all gold, whether it came from Constantinople, Ctesiphon, or Rome. The weapon, in seeking to destroy a specific symbol of trust, risked annihilating the foundation of trust itself. This reveals the ultimate, chilling lesson of the Silent War. The most dangerous aspect of turning currency into a weapon was not the act of striking the first blow, but the utter impossibility of predicting where the final, fragmenting pieces would land. The principles of this silent war did not vanish with the fall of Constantinople or the closing of the last imperial mint. They simply found new patrons and new battlefields in the age of gunpowder and nation-states. As Europe fractured into competing kingdoms, the ancient art of currency sabotage evolved from a shadowy imperial tactic into a formal, if still deniable, instrument of early modern statecraft. The conflicts between England and France, a rivalry spanning centuries, provide a clear window into this continuity. During the War of Spanish Succession in the early 1700s, and again in later conflicts, British intelligence services orchestrated sophisticated operations to produce and circulate counterfeit French gold coins, the famed louis d'or. British engravers, some of the finest in the world, were tasked with creating perfect dies. Tons of inferior gold alloy were secretly minted into these impeccable forgeries, which were then smuggled across the Channel. The objectives were a direct echo of the ancient past, to drain France of real gold by exchanging it for worthless metal, to fund British covert activities on the continent with the enemy's own corrupted currency, and to create inflationary pressure that would weaken the French war effort from within. This was no longer a speculative theory, but a documented policy, a calculated line item in the ledger of war. Similarly, the sprawling devastation of the 30 Years' War saw the tactic descend to a more brutal, localized level. Warlords and mercenary captains, desperate to pay their restless armies, would frequently seize control of local mints. They would then issue wildly debased coinage, often called kipper and whippersite money, with only a fraction of the promised silver. Soldiers paid with these coins would then force them upon terrified populations for supplies, creating hyperinflation so severe that people were said to need wheelbarrows of cash to buy a loaf of bread. This was economic warfare turned inward, a self-cannibalizing strategy that devastated the very lands the armies fought over, leaving a legacy of hardship that lasted generations. These early modern examples are not separate from the ancient stories of Athenian owls and Persian Solidi. They are their direct descendants. They represent the maturation of a dark art. What was once a deniable tool for empires became a formalized, if still covert, branch of intelligence work for the emerging nation-state. The through line is unmistakable: the deliberate corruption of an enemy's monetary trust as a force multiplier, a way to win wars without always winning battles. This historical arc positions the silent wars of antiquity not as curious footnotes, but as the foundational prototypes. They were the first, rough drafts of a playbook that would be refined over millennia, proving that the most enduring weapons are often those that target not the body, but the belief system of a civilization. This ancient playbook for economic conflict never disappeared. It simply traded its cloak for a suit. In our modern world, the silent war of currencies has found its legal, overt successor, the system of international economic sanctions. Where a Persian satrap once secretly minted fake solidi, a national treasury today publicly freezes the assets of a rival state. The core strategic goal is startlingly consistent: to cripple an adversary's economy, destabilize its leadership, and force political change, all while avoiding the immediate costs and risks of direct military conflict. Both are forms of calculated pressure, weapons that target the ledger book before the battlefield. The profound difference lies in the realm of deniability. Ancient counterfeiting was a shadow game, its power derived from secrecy and the inability of the target to prove who had struck the blow. A Byzantine emperor could suspect Persian involvement, but without a captured order, he could not rally the world to his cause. Modern sanctions operate in the full light of international law and diplomacy. They are announced in press conferences, detailed in official gazettes, and enforced by global banking networks. Their power derives not from secrecy, but from collective public action, a coalition of states openly declaring a financial blockade. This shift from covert to overt reflects a change in the international system itself. We now have forums for public accusation and frameworks, however imperfect, for lawful economic measures. Yet for the population living under a sanctions regime, the daily experience can feel eerily familiar to that of an ancient city flooded with bad coin. The currency might still look the same, but its ability to buy essential goods from the global marketplace evaporates. Inflation rises as imports vanish, savings lose value, and ordinary people bear the hardship of an economic siege designed to pressure their rulers. Whether through the silent injection of false silver or the public freezing of bank accounts, the mechanism is the same: constrict the flow of economic lifeblood. The modern sanction is the ancient counterfeit, stripped of its anonymity and institutionalized. It confirms a timeless truth in statecraft, that the power to grant or deny access to the system of value remains one of the most potent instruments of power ever devised. Across the centuries, from the Aegean to the Indus, a clear and chilling pattern emerges from the shadows. These isolated stories of forged owls and debased solidi are not random acts of economic crime, but the visible fragments of a recurring clandestine strategy. For state-sponsored counterfeiting to function as a weapon, the historical stage required a very specific set of conditions. First, there needed to be rival powers whose economies were sufficiently interconnected through trade or conflict. You cannot destabilize a currency that never leaves its own borders. The weapon relies on a shared marketplace of trust. Second, the aggressor required access to advanced minting technology and metallurgical knowledge, the capacity to produce a convincing imitation, not just a crude fake. This was not the work of a lone blacksmith, but of a workshop with state-level resources. Third, and perhaps most crucially, there had to be a motive for deniable conflict, a situation where open warfare was too costly, too risky, or too diplomatically explosive. The silent war thrived in the gray zones between peace and declared battle, in cold wars and simmering rivalries where a direct strike was unthinkable. The targets of these operations were never chosen at random. They were consistently the most stable, high-value currencies of their day, the monetary pillars of dominant powers. The Athenian owl, the Roman denarius, the Byzantine solidus, each represented the peak of economic and political authority in its region. Attacking these coins was a symbolic strike at the heart of an empire's legitimacy, but it was also a supremely practical one. A widely trusted international currency traveled far and wide, offering countless avenues for infiltration. Its very ubiquity was its vulnerability. By corrupting the symbol everyone relied upon, an aggressor could inflict damage across a vast network, from frontier trading posts to the capital's own treasury, all while maintaining a facade of plausible deniability. What this mosaic of evidence reveals is that economic sabotage was not a one-time trick, but a recurrent instrument of ancient geopolitics. It was a tool pulled from the same chest as espionage, proxy warfare, and diplomatic intrigue, a sophisticated means of applying pressure. The patterns show us that ancient states understood a profound and modern-seeming truth. that the strength of a civilization rests as much on confidence as on conquest. They learned that you could hollow out an enemy's power by systematically eroding the trust of its merchants, its soldiers, and its taxpayers, turning the very foundation of daily life into a front line. While the smoking scroll may never be found, the collective testimony of the coins themselves is overwhelming. They tell us that long before cyber warfare or financial sanctions, the ancients were masters of a silent conflict, where the most decisive blows were struck not by the sword but by the mint. The silent war was won not in the clash of armies but in the quiet corrosion of trust. From the Athenian owls to the Roman denarii and the Byzantine solidi, the pattern reveals a weapon of deliberate high-level statecraft. These were not the random crimes of desperate individuals, but calculated campaigns authorized in palace corridors and carried out in protected workshops. The evidence, while often circumstantial, builds an overwhelming case. The geographic clustering of forgeries in strategic conflict zones, the technical sophistication matching official mint quality, and the timing coinciding with periods of intense geopolitical rivalry all point toward institutional sponsorship. Athens faced imitations circulating in Spartan-influenced regions during a total war. Rome contended with suspect coinage on its Persian frontier, a pressure point in a Cold War. Byzantium fought a covert duel with Sasanian dies that perfectly replicated its imperial gold. In each instance, the target was the same: the financial and psychological foundation of a rival's power. This recurring strategy underscores a profound historical truth. The stability of an empire rested as much on monetary confidence as on military might. By secretly sabotaging the currency that paid soldiers, collected taxes, and facilitated trade, a rival could trigger inflation, inspire civil unrest, and cripple logistical networks long before a single spear was thrown. These shadow wars were not peripheral skirmishes, they were central theaters in the struggle for supremacy. The gradual erosion of trust in a state's money could hollow out its authority from within, making it vulnerable to rebellion, invasion, or collapse. The fall of a great power is rarely a single event. It is a slow unraveling, and often the first threads to fray are those of economic faith. So the next time you look at an ancient coin in a museum, see beyond the worn face and faded inscription. See it for what it truly was: a piece of propaganda, a token of trust, and potentially a weapon in history's quietest, most decisive wars. The battle for control over the symbols of value is a conflict without an end date. It reminds us to look deeper into the stories we think we know, to question the surface of history, and to listen for the echoes of those silent, shaping battles fought not with swords, but with the very idea of money itself.